teacher, and it's a privilege to, even though he was the mind and developer of Accordance, he does far more than just that. He's a great teacher, and we're excited to have him today. Before we get going, and I turn it over to Dr. Brown, I want you to know, and you might have heard this before if you've been to our earlier webinars, in the webinar control panel, down near the bottom, you'll see a place where there's a thing called questions. And as we're going through this, if you have a question, type it in, and then Mark and Linda will be, and myself will be there to try to answer the questions we can. And those questions that we cannot answer, we will present to Roy at the end of the class and see if he can do it. Again, so we thank you for being with us today, and we have a special coupon code that we're going to give you at the end of the class too, that will give you an additional 25% off of one-time purchase of anything in the store that's not on sale. So you might want to take notes of what Roy shows and talks about, and if they're of interest, we'll come back at the very end and talk about those. So with that, I now turn it over to Dr. Roy Brown and this session this afternoon. Dr. Brown, it's all yours.
Okay, I'm going to turn off the video now, and then we'll come back to it at the end. We'll just look at the keynote initially. And so what we're going to do is look at the contribution of archaeology to biblical studies. And by way of introduction, we're going to first talk about the relationship of archaeology to the Bible. This will give us a context. Most of this will be actually showing archaeological discoveries, but we want to first talk about the relationship of archaeology to the Bible. And then what we're going to do is show the various contributions of archaeology in different groups. For example, we're going to start off with pictures from archaeology, which may be sort of a surprise to some people because we didn't realize pictures exist in archaeology. We'll then move on to objects and sites from archaeology, and then we'll go to inscriptions from archaeology. And all of these, almost all the focus on the archaeology up to now is mainly related to the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, but then we'll also conclude with archaeology of the New Testament, which also does a similar type thing, except from a later, somewhat later period. So let's talk about some of the questions related to the Bible and archaeology itself. Archaeology does have limitations, and this does not mean to denigrate archaeology. I actually personally love archaeology. I love to go to the sites and see what archaeologists have done, but there are limitations we have to keep in mind, especially when we talk about the relationship of archaeology to the Bible. First of all, archaeology cannot prove the truth of the Bible. A lot of people, some people use archaeology to say this proves the Bible. Now, I think it does support the Bible in many, many ways, but really archaeology cannot really prove the truth of this Bible, especially for what we call theological or moral values of the Bible. This is really a limitation of archaeology, as interesting as it may be. And sometimes in archaeology, it can be difficult to find overlap between archaeology and the Bible. And the reason is because each of them deal with different kinds of questions. Archaeology focuses more on the life and times of the period of the Bible, but the Bible tends to focus more on the relationship of God to mankind. And sometimes they really don't overlap, even though there's sometimes a little bit of overlap, but really it can be hard to find overlap between archaeology and the Bible. And then finally, even though archaeology is definitely more quote unquote scientific and has a more scientific nature to it, it's still subject to difficulties of interpretation. And if you read popular journals such as Biblical Archaeology Review, which happens to be distributed also electronically on Accordance, that it is, archaeologists disagree with each other a lot. It's still very much subject to difficulties of interpretation. So those are some of the limitations of archaeology. But archaeology does have a lot that it can contribute. First of all, it does give evidence of things mentioned in the Bible. It doesn't prove the Bible and quote unquote, but it certainly can give evidences of things that are mentioned in the Bible. In fact, there's quite a few evidences that archaeology can give, and that's what we'll be showing a little bit later today. Archaeology is especially useful for filling in details not included in the Bible. That sometimes you'll find things in archaeology that shed light or fill in details that the Bible simply doesn't talk about, but yet you know that it's connected to something that's mentioned in the Bible. Archaeology also can give us a clearer picture of the people, the events, and the life and times of the Bible. That the Bible sometimes, if you just read it in the Bible, you don't really fully understand what's really going on here, because the Bible doesn't always give details or always that we would like to know. Now, you might say the Bible doesn't need to give details because that wasn't its purpose. But in any case, archaeology can definitely give us a clearer picture of the people, events, and life and times of the Bible, which is what we're going to show here. Now, one thing I want to distinguish here is archaeology versus history and geography. And the reason I do this is because history and geography are also involved in our understanding of the Bible, but they're not necessarily the same as archaeology. Archaeology generally depends upon evidence that's extracted from excavations in the ground. And the ground, really, what's fascinating in archaeology is how burying something in the ground actually preserves it. If it weren't buried, it wouldn't be preserved. So this is really the focus of archaeology, is excavations in the ground. History is a man-made chronological record of events or people preserved over time that's totally, or mostly, I'd say totally independent of archaeology. And I'll talk in just a second why I distinguish the two. Geography is the study of the physical characteristics of the surface features of the earth. Now, all three of these have overlap with the Bible. Archaeology has overlap with the Bible. History has overlap. Secular history does overlap the Bible and helps clarify things. And even geography overlaps the Bible. But those two, history and geography, are not exactly the same thing. So when we look at them, archaeology only enhances but does not replace the things in the Bible related to history and geography. For example, and here you'll see what I'm talking about here. History records, for example, the Roman emperors mentioned in the New Testament: Augustus, Tiberius, or Claudius. I believe those are the main three that are mentioned by name in the New Testament. Well, nobody says archaeology disproves Augustus or disproves Tiberius or whatever, because these are things that are recorded in history that happen to be also mentioned in the Bible. The most that archaeology can do is tell us a little bit more about Augustus, Tiberius, or Claudius, plus many other historical events in the Bible, but it doesn't really disprove. We just say we know Augustus existed because it's in history. Likewise, geography tells us more about the places in the Bible, such as, and I named three common examples: the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, or the Sea of Galilee. The Bible does not tell us that the Dead Sea is 1,200 feet or roughly, or 500 meters below the, or 400 and something meters below the sea level. That's something that geography tells us. It's interesting, the Bible does tell us a little more about the Dead Sea because it calls it the Salt Sea in the Hebrew Bible, and then certainly it is very salty. But my point is that these are things that we learn about Bible background that are not archaeology. Archaeology focuses on the things related to excavations in the ground. So now let's review, and this will be the majority of this presentation, examples from archaeology that illustrate or enhance what we read about in the Bible. And I'm going to start here with pictures. In fact, those of you that are quite familiar with archaeology, you can even see in the background here, I show a picture from archaeology. This is the siege of Lachish, which I'll show a little bit more in detail later. But what pictures do is pictures enable us to visualize people and events in the Bible better, because the Bible obviously is just words. It does not have pictures, even if a lot of stuff printed about the Bible today have pictures. The Bible itself doesn't have what we would call pictures, but archaeology does have some pictures. So let's look at a few of them now. And what I'm going to do is actually quote the verse in the Bible, and I believe this will be available in, as a PDF later on, or a download later on, or a video later on. So I don't know if you have to take notes, but I'll be quoting verses from the Bible that actually mentioned a person or event, and then I'll show you how that is illustrated in archaeology. And that's the way we're going to do this. And we're going to start out roughly chronologically and talk about King Shalmaneser III. He was a king in Assyria, and King Jehu, and this is the date of the reign of King Jehu, 859 to 824 BCE. And 2 Kings tells us that thus Jehu eradicated Baal out of Israel. So there's a verse that mentions Jehu. There's other verses also, but that's one of the main ones. And what's fascinating in archaeology is that they discovered a stele. Here you see on the left a column that actually shows and portrays pictures on the left from the King Shalmaneser III in Assyria. And if we zoom in, one of these pictures is actually a picture of King Jehu that pays tribute to this Assyrian king. And that's, of course, the guy that's bowing down is King Jehu, because the writers of history get to make the history as they want to portray it. King Shalmaneser is the victorious Assyrian king, and here is King Jehu, and we know that from the cuneiform inscription that surrounds the picture, or some would say it might be his ambassador that's representing King Jehu, but this is one of the earliest actual illustrations of an Israelite king, or at least an Israelite representing the king here. So this is an example of what I mean by pictures of something that are actually mentioned in the Bible. Another example, all of the Assyrian kings that we know by name in the Bible, many of them have pictures that we found in archaeology. What's interesting is we don't have this so much from Egypt, because in the Bible tends to refer to the Egyptian kings as just Pharaoh. But here we have a guy named Tiglath-Pileser III, reigned 745, 727 BC, and 2 Kings tells us that he came and captured all the land of Naphtali, that would be the northern, a tribe in the north, and he carried them captive to Assyria. And today, in the excavations, we actually have the picture of Tiglath-Pileser III, and this is how he's portrayed. Many people have pointed out, what's that on his right hand? It is not a watch, I can assure you. It's some sort of a decorative bracelet or something that looks a little bit like a watch, but he's not having some iWatch or something, or Psycho watch on his hand there. And he's, of course, portraying the king with a fancy beard, because this was the style of the Assyrian kings at that time. Another king that's mentioned in the Bible, Sargon, from 722 to 705, is mentioned once in Isaiah 20, in the year that the commander came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him, and he fought against Ashdod and captured it. Well, we also have a picture of Sargon, who's standing there with a similar style beard. Also, I might mention a similar style wrist bracelet. It's not a watch, but we know that we see this portrayal of Sargon. I've clipped off here. He's got a sword, I believe, in his left hand, or something like a sword or scepter, and he's meeting with somebody else in the picture there. And then we have the more well-known king, Sennacherib, or Sennacherib in Hebrew, the son of Sargon, who reigned right after him, and he also is mentioned in 2 Kings 18. And in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. So there he is mentioned. He's probably mentioned more than once. And here we have two pictures of King Sennacherib. The first picture we're going to show later is connected with the siege of Lachish. And what's interesting, you'll notice his face is blotted out here because probably after he died, his successors didn't like him, or maybe somebody rebelled and didn't like him. But then we have another picture, again, a similar style of hair and beard of King Sennacherib here from Archaeology. Now, what's very fascinating is we don't just have pictures of kings in archaeology, we actually have a picture of an event that's mentioned in archaeology, the siege of Lachish, and that is actually mentioned in 2nd Chronicles 32:9. And by the way, I am mentioning all these verses, not expecting everybody to know these by memory, but I hope this will challenge us to study the Bible for these more obscure references that we may not be as familiar with. So in 2nd Chronicles 32:9, it says, after this, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, sent his servants to Jerusalem while he was besieging Lachish with all of his forces with him. And what's fascinating is we actually have a picture of this siege chronologically of Lachish illustrated here. And this is a picture of the relief showing the battle scene. In the lower part, you see this Assyrian war machine going up the ramp. And at the top here, with the soldiers, you see the Israelite soldiers with a bow trying to defend Lachish. And then these little, it's hard to describe what they are. They look like sticks, but they're actually torches of fire that they're throwing out of the city to try to burn the Assyrian war machine here. And what they've done, what the Assyrian artists did, was to compress this in time. Because if you look at the lower right, you see the prisoners already walking out of the city. So what they're doing is putting time chronology left to right to portray the event both in space and time. I think it's a pretty clever picture. So now as we go on now, we see there's the details of the Israelite soldiers, how they were dressed and so on from the time of 701 BCE. We know this event almost to the year. And then we see now the surrender of the captives here that are coming out of the city. And some of them, probably the leaders, we see the horrible cruelty of the Assyrians where they impaled these three guys here on the right. Because they didn't surrender, they tried to hold off the Assyrians. And then, of course, one thing that's always occurs when you conquer a city is you carry the loot from the city. And this shows the loot being carried on carts with, I believe those are horses or donkeys there, carrying away the loot from the city. And then we have another horrible scene of torture, probably of the leaders. The Israelite leaders were being tortured by the Assyrian soldiers. And then chronologically, we come up to the king. And here's the Israelites. And these are actually portrayals of the Israelites begging mercy from the king here, showing the king victorious there. And here's a close-up picture of the king with his servants keeping him cool here on his throne. So this is really fascinating. It's one of the few instances where we actually see an ancient event portrayed in pictures. Now we're going to go to objects from archaeology. Okay, and objects are what really you find more of in archaeology than pictures. Pictures are relatively rare, but I wanted to show you the more fascinating and interesting ones. Objects enable us to understand the background and context of the Bible and their connection to the Bible. So let's look at some of these objects. Well, the first object we want to look at is a mud brick of Rameses II in the 13th century BC. Now, I recognize there's debates on the date of the Exodus and who the Pharaoh of the Exodus is. Don't want to go into that because the mud brick would apply to either date. But this one happens to have the stamp of Rameses II. In Exodus 5:7, it says, "You're no longer to give the people straw to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. Well, let's look at an actual brick. And there's a brick. It's mainly mud, but if we zoom into the brick, we now see that there is indeed pieces of straw in that brick. And if we look more closely in the center, it actually has the stamp of Pharaoh on that brick. And if you go to Egypt today, I know you can't go right now because of this horrible virus, but if you go to Egypt, you'll see structures, not just single bricks, but actual structures that are made of mud brick that illustrate this passage, even along with the detail of the straw. Okay, let's look at another object, the horned altar from Beersheba from the 10th to 8th century BCE. In Leviticus, it mentions about the priest will take some of the blood and put it on the horns of the altar of burnt offering. So we're talking about the altar, but how did those horns look? Well, we really don't know how the original burnt altar in Leviticus looked, but we do have pictures of this later on. And here they've excavated, and this is the actual altar from Beersheba, from the place of worship, in which you see the horns on all four corners of this object here. And this is a restoration where it looks a little more clear based upon what they found archaeologically of the reconstructed altar. So this gives us an idea of what do they mean by the horns of the altar. And there's other verses that talk about people grabbing the horns of the altar in the temple and so on, but this gives us a little bit idea the horns were definitely on the four corners of the altar. Okay, in Amos 6:4, it talks about beds of ivory, and that this is again roughly from the 7th to 8th century BCE. Amos condemns those who are wealthy and he talks about those who recline on beds of ivory and sprawl on their couches. Well, what are beds of ivory? How is a bed made out of ivory? Well, today we know a little bit. The bed itself, the structure wasn't necessarily ivory, but it was covered with ivory carvings. And we can today see many examples of this. Probably this was done by Phoenician craftsmen. This is a very famous example in the British Museum of the lion attacking the man at his throat. And here's another example of an ivory carving of a sphinx-like figure, or possibly a cherubim-like figure that was also, and you could see the intricate carving out of ivory. And some of these were actually found at the excavations at Samaria, which is who Amos was aiming his message to the rich who lived in the palace in Samaria there. So this illustrates what is he talking about when he talks about the ivory and beds of ivory. Okay, in Daniel 4:30, it talks about the king Nebuchadnezzar, and the king was a little bit proud and exclaiming, "Is this not Babylon the Great that I have built?" And we have now found today a building brick of Nebuchadnezzar, and we know it's from him. This is one brick, there's many others, because the stamp, you see it written in cuneiform here, actually mentions this brick is from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So here again, we have an illustration of what he meant when he said, "Is this not Babylon the Great that I have built?" So those are just a few objects, and believe me, I had to pick from just really what I consider the major objects in archaeology. There's many, many, many more, but I just wanted to give you some of the more interesting examples. So let's turn now to sites from archaeology. A site enables us to understand the details of life in the Bible. It helps us understand even the layout of the site and how the site was structured during the time of the Bible. First site, one of the oldest ones we have that I believe is specifically mentioned in the Bible from the period of the Judges, or from maybe the early period, the late period of the Judges, or early period of King David in the 11th century BCE. In 2 Samuel, in chapter 2, it mentions about Avner, the son of Ner, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon, Givon, and Joab met them where? By the pool of Gibeon. Well, they have now excavated around Gibeon, and they found this huge cistern, even with steps going down to it, which may well be the pool at Gibeon, because Gibeon's not a big site. And today, it's El Jib in Arabic. It's almost certainly the right place, and this is really the only pool there, and it's not a huge site. So this may well be the pool of Gibeon that is mentioned in the Bible, even with steps. And of course, this was used for storing water because that was important at that time. Okay, what about the city gates? This is something that I think where archaeology really helps us, because it talks about in Ruth 4, chapter 4, Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. He took 10 men of the elders of the city, so they sat down. Well, what on earth does gate have to do with 10 men of the city? If it's just the gate is just a door, they're going to block the entrance of the city with those 10 men. But archaeology tells us gates was much more to a city, was much more than just simply a door on the wall of the city. And I have a couple of illustrations of this. This is the gate that you find at Dan, one of the cities mentioned in the Bible. It's in the northern part of Israel, which is why you see the trees there. But you see now from this gate, a gate is not just simply a door, but rather it has these chambers on the side here. And those chambers would have been places where they stored things, maybe soldiers were stationed there, but they also served as meeting places for the people. So to say that he took 10 men of the elders and sat down at the gate, and they even would have benches here at the gate, illustrates what is being talked about in Ruth. And we see another similar example in the gates of Megiddo. And there's actually several gate systems in Megiddo, but this illustrates that the gate wasn't just simply one room, but either they had 2 pairs of rooms or even 3 pairs of rooms, depending on the city. And so there's many examples of gates that we see today archaeologically in the excavations. In fact, I have to point out one more example. It's not in the pictures, is Machanaim, which is mentioned near Tel Azekah, and it's near where David fought Goliath, and they actually found 2 city gates. And if you look at the excavations of those, they have exactly the same structure with 4 or 6 rooms near the entrance to the city where the guards would be stationed or where the people would meet for the city. So this is a good example of archaeology helps us understand why would 10 people meet at the city gate. Okay, then we talk about the high places. They're mentioned many times in the Old Testament, and it mentions in 1 King, the king, and I believe this was Jeroboam, consulted and made 2 golden calves. He set one at Bethel, the other he put at Dan. And it's interesting, if you look at the geography, Bethel is the southern boundary of the northern kingdom after it split from Judah, and this Dan is at the northern boundary, Bethel at the south, Dan at the north. And so what they've done in the excavations at Tel Dan is find the actual site here. And this is the site of the altar in Dan. And they've reconstructed with this metal frame what the altar would look like, because they would have burnt offerings on the altar. These steps on the right would go inside the holy place, which is where they would have put the golden calf. And I think it's fascinating that they've actually found the site where the golden calf would have been set up in Dan, along with a reconstruction of the altar in Dan. Another very interesting place that's similar to that is from 2 Kings 12, 2 through 3. King Joash did right in the sight of the Lord all of his days, but only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense in the high places. Well, this is brought up again and again, many times in the Old Testament. What on earth is the problem with these high places? And archaeology tells us a little bit more. In Tel Arad, they actually excavated an entire sanctuary. And you see here that it's even modeled after the temple. You see here this big square in the middle, which is the offering, the altar where they would put offering. You see this site where you'd enter into the temple. And what's most fascinating here, which you see in the back, which I'll show in more detail, is they actually found a Holy of Holies here, so that we have here a high place patterned after the temple, in which people still sacrificed and burned incense outside of Jerusalem. Now, there's a little bit of debate whether this Holy of Holies was to the Lord or to an idol, but I think it still illustrates the point. Here we found in archaeology an actual high place on a city outside of Jerusalem that has a similar pattern to the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, and then the one that I think is the most fascinating, and if you ever go to Israel, please don't miss it, is Hezekiah's tunnel. This is from about 700 BCE, and 2 Kings 20:20, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of King Hezekiah and all of his might, and how he made the pool and the conduit and brought water into the city." Well, there it is mentioned in 2 Kings, and I believe there's a parallel passage in Chronicles. He made a pool for the water to collect and a conduit to bring water into the city. Well, today we can not only see this conduit, but you can walk through the conduit. I think it's a fascinating experience if you ever get the opportunity to. Now, when you go through the conduit, they actually found in the conduit an inscription, and here's a reproduction of the inscription written in the Hebrew at the time of King Hezekiah, and it actually tells how they built this tunnel or conduit. They started from each side, and as they got in the middle, the workers began to hear each other so that they could find the point of breakthrough between each side. And this tunnel, I might add, is a phenomenal engineering achievement at the time. It's about 1,500 feet or 500 meters, a half a kilometer long. And for this technology at this time, it's really amazing they'd even built it at all. So let's look at a few pictures of this tunnel. As this is how it appears today. It's hewn out of solid rock, and there's water still flowing in it to this day, which go down to the pool of Bethesda, which we'll actually show a little bit later here in this presentation. And then as you go inside the tunnel toward the middle, you see that they didn't quite know how to meet. Here's what I call a false tunnel, where they started to dig in one direction, but apparently maybe from the acoustics, echoes, or whatever, they went the wrong way and decided to do it. But then they finally met in the center, and this is actually the point of meeting, where you can actually see in the way they dug the tunnel how the instruments used to dig the tunnel actually change direction because they're coming from each side. And then finally, well, that's all I'm going to show about the tunnel. But what's interesting about this tunnel is that Hezekiah built it to withstand siege, because water was very, very important to survive a siege. But what's really fascinating, since we're talking about the tunnel, is that King Sennacherib, who we know from the Bible is the one that laid siege to Jerusalem with Hezekiah there, actually writes about this from the other side. And in 2 Chronicles 32:22, it says very clearly, "So the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the power of King Sennacherib of Assyria." There is his name mentioned. But what we found in archaeological excavations is Sennacherib himself wrote on this prism. It's an octagonal prism. I think there's several copies of it in different museums. And what he does in this prism is actually mention that siege. And he says in the prism, "As for Hezekiah the Judean," this is not the Bible, this is King Sennacherib writing, "I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage." I think this is really fascinating, because he admits that he only besieged Jerusalem, he locked up the city, but he never conquered it. And that's exactly what happened here, that King Hezekiah did withstand the siege of the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Now later on, of course, about 100 years later, or a little over 100 years later, the Babylonians did penetrate and destroy the city. But here, Hezekiah was able to withstand the siege of Sennacherib, and we actually have archaeological confirmation of that from this prism that Sennacherib wrote. Now, moving along in history, we now come to King Cyrus. In Ezra 5:13, it says after the Assyrians took the northern kingdom into the exile, the Babylonians took the southern kingdom. King Cyrus of Persia conquered the Babylonians. And then we read in Ezra 5:13, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon. Remember, he actually conquered Babylon. He's actually a Medo-Persian king, but he was now conquered. He now controlled Babylon. King Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild his house of God. Well, what we see today physically in archaeology, it still survives in Iran. Not many people have seen it because it's in Iran, but there's actually a tomb of Cyrus who's mentioned here in the Bible. It remains to this day. And later on, we're going to talk about inscriptions that actually parallel this decree that's mentioned here. Okay, so that is the major inscription, major sites mentioned in the Bible, and believe me, there's many, many, many more. I just picked the ones that I thought would be of most interest that clearly seem to have a connection with the Bible. But now let's look at inscriptions. Inscriptions are fascinating. Why? Because they are eyewitness accounts that are written down. They're writing that are written down of eyewitness accounts that may relate to people, places, and events in the Bible. And what's fascinating about inscriptions is that they are writing. If you can read the writing, you can generally understand what is this person talking about who is an eyewitness of the event at that time. The earliest inscription that relates to the Bible is in Egypt from Pharaoh Merneptah. It's a little hard to pronounce, from the god Ptah, Merneptah, Stele. And in Genesis, we read a verse, and that was from 1200 BCE, from the 13th century BC. Okay, in Genesis, it says in Genesis 32, this was God or the angel talking to Jacob. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and prevailed. And so this is the very first mention of Israel in the Bible. And the word Yisrael in Hebrew means he will strive, or God will, you've striven with God. And that's what the name means. But what's interesting in archaeology, the very first mention of Israel is in this Stele from this Pharaoh during the time of the judges. And this is the very earliest, to as far as we know right now, mention of Israel from Egypt, from this Pharaoh. And I'm zooming in the hieroglyphics. It's written in hieroglyphics. It's underneath. Unfortunately, they've recently put a piece of plastic so you can't get a good picture below. But this is how the Stele looks. And this is the inscription here. It says, Israel is laid waste. It has no more seed. Now, we don't know exactly the context. This was a report to the Pharaoh written on the Stele. And we don't know the context. Is this probably because of the conquest of Egypt? Is this because of the chaos during the period of the judges when there was no king? He just describes the situation in Israel. But the point of this is the very earliest mention of Israel in archaeology outside the Bible. Then we go to another inscription, which is really fascinating. It's the Balaam or Deir Alla inscription from the 9th century BCE. In Numbers 22:5, it talks about Balaam when it says, or Balaam, when it says he sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor, at Pethor, which is near the river, near the Euphrates River, it's understood, in the land of the sons of people to call him. This is the king, the Moabite king, calling Balaam to pronounce curses. And so Balaam came to this area of Moab, and they have found, it's a little bit mysterious, but they have found an inscription from the 9th century, a little bit later than this, that actually mentions Balaam and even quotes some of the prophecies of Balaam that I don't have shown here in the text from the book of Numbers. Now, it's a real mystery because the dating of the writing and the archaeology points a little bit later. Was there some memory of Balaam that was passed down in Moab from the time when this event took place during the latter part of the Exodus? But what's fascinating is here you see it written in what's called Canaanite or Paleo-Hebrew, but it actually cites Balaam and quotes or alludes very strongly to the prophecies that are made in Balaam. Okay, now we have an inscription related to King Ahab. He's a little bit more well-known king, 879 to 852 BC. In 1 Kings 16:29, it says, Ahab, the son of Omri, became king of Israel in the 38th year of Asa, the king of Judah. And what's interesting is we have now an inscription and a picture, by the way, of Shalmaneser, or possibly one of his servants, that there's a lot of writing superimposed on this statue or this relief of the king here. And what's interesting is this is the only mention from Assyria by an Assyrian king of King Ahab in Israel. And those that have deciphered the cuneiform here found that Karkar, his royal city, I, the king, destroyed, and I destroyed 10,000 soldiers of Ahab the Israelites. And this is the only mention specifically by name of Ahab and Israelites by an Assyrian king. But there is a mention of Ahab specifically by name outside of the Bible, and it's also almost contemporaneous because this stele, this relief was put up roughly at the same time and later excavated. Now we have a even more famous inscription that's called the Mesha Stone or Moabite Stone. And in 2 Kings chapter 3, it mentions this king. Now Mesha, the king of Moab, was a sheep breeder. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. Well, guess what? We have actually found a stele written by the king, written exactly by this same king, that commemorates his victory after he rebelled against the king of Israel. Now, there's this interesting story behind this stele, how they found it. It was found intact originally and broken up by indigenous people because they thought they'd get more money. But fortunately, they made a plaster cast. And here you see the restored plaster cast, the actual Moabite stone restored here. But what's more interesting is what he wrote. He actually identifies, he says, I am Mesha, the son of Chemosh, the king of Moab. Chemosh is the god. And he mentions now Omri, who's mentioned in the Bible, was king of Israel. He oppressed Moab many days. And then his son, who he doesn't mention by name, but this is Ahab, succeeded him. And he also said, I shall oppress Moab. But Chemosh, the god of Moab, told me to go, take Nebo from Israel. And this has to do with about the king of Moab rebelling against the king of Israel, although it says when he died, apparently the later part of Ahab's reign. And I took from there the vessels of, now this is really fascinating, that a Moabite mentions the name of God that we call Yud-He Vav or W-H, Hey, Yud-He Vav Hey, the Lord or Adonai. He actually mentions this by name in this inscription, and I dragged these vessels before Chemosh. This Moabite stone or Mesha stone is really fascinating. It mentions these kings, it mentions the name of God, it mentions the conflict between the Bible and God, and really gives us a sort of a different, the opposite side of the story that's mentioned in the Bible. Okay, another very important inscription is the House of David from the 9th century BC. And remember, David reigned only 100 years earlier. And it says here in 1 Kings 12:19 that so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. Okay, and there's the stone. It is written by an Aramean king, and it's written in Aramaean or Aramite, get it straight here, Aramean, and it is. But what's fascinating is that where you see in the white, and you see the letters again are Canaanite or Paleo-Hebrew. And then if we zoom in, we see 6 letters written in Hebrew, or written in Hebrew language. Bet, Yud, Tav, David, Dalet, Vav, Dalet. That is House of David. Okay, here is House of David, which is the way that they called the dynasty, but this is from the 9th century, only 100 years after David lived. And this is probably the very earliest witness that we have outside the Bible that the House of David actually did exist. It's actually mentioned roughly in the chronology that is mentioned there. Another fascinating inscription, I'm doing these in chronological order, 7th and 8th century BC, or maybe 6th century, possibly. There's some debate on the dates. We read in the Bible that says what we call the high priest's prayer. The Lord, many of you have heard this, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. Well, believe it or not, they have found this as an inscription on a silver amulet from the 7th century, before even the Old Testament was finished, not even mention the New Testament. It's hard to read, but you can see it's clearly written, Hebrew letters. It was rolled up like a cylinder, and they unrolled it here, and it was kept in a tomb from the time of the 7th century BC, and this is the very earliest witness of a Bible text that the priestly prayer was mentioned here. They probably took it to be a little bit something like an amulet, that by putting this prayer in the tomb, this would bless the deceased that was in the tomb there. But this is the absolute earliest written text of a piece of text of the Bible that we have from the 7th century BC. Another very fascinating inscription is not just from the Bible, but even the Philistines we have written evidence of from the 7th century BC. In 1 Samuel chapter 5, it says, they sent the ark of God to Ekron. So there we have the ark, and that's where they is the Philistines, not the Israelites. This was after the famous battle of Ebenezer. And then in 1 Samuel 21:10 talks about David, who is escaping from Saul. He fled that day from Saul, went to Lachish, king of Gath. Gath is one of the 5 Philistine cities. What we have here is an inscription that we found in Ekron, not in Gath. But what's fascinating about it, it's a dedication to a Philistine temple. It's one of the few inscriptions written by the Philistines. It's written in Paleo-Hebrew or Canaanite. But what's fascinating about it, it was found, actually mentions the name Ekron, which is the name of one of the 5 Philistine cities in the Bible. And what's really interesting is that the king is Lachish, which is, it's not the same Lachish, but the name Lachish was the names of kings of the Philistines. And Lachish is mentioned in the Bible as another king, but there his same name is used in this Philistine dedication. Now, Jerusalem is a very, very famous city in the Bible. Everybody's heard of Jerusalem. But when was Jerusalem mentioned outside the Bible? Well, it actually turns out quite early. In the early 6th century BC, we have an inscription of Jerusalem, but I wanted to read this verse from Joshua chapter 10, which is significant because it says how it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai. This is the first mention of Jerusalem by full name. Now, I recognize that the Melchizedek was from Salem, and that may be an reference to Jerusalem, but this is the first full name of Jerusalem as we have it in the Bible. And we have found an inscription that mentions the full name of Jerusalem here. There's Yud, Ra, Shin, Lamed, Mem at the end. This is written in Paleo-Hebrew, and this was found in a burial cave in the Judean foothills. It is the earliest archaeological mention of the full name of Jerusalem from the 6th century BC. Okay, and then we have what's really fascinating is an inscription from Arad from the early 6th century BC. This is still during the time of Jeremiah. It talks in 2 Chronicles 3:3. It talks about, now these are the foundations which Solomon laid for building the house of God. The expression, the house of God, is very important. It's a reference to the temple. In fact, in Hebrew, they don't really, I've got to be careful how I say this, they don't really have a word for temple like we do. They do have a word, hechal, for inner sanctuary, and so on, but they don't have a word for temple. Usually in Hebrew, they just call the temple a house, but it's the house of God. Well, here's the expression, house of God. We have now found on the excavation, on the what's called the Arad inscriptions, we have found written on ink on pottery, and there you see the same style of Paleo-Hebrew, the very earliest mention of the temple, the house of the Lord, or Adonai, Yud-He Vav-He, and it says, he is in the house of Yud-He Vav-He. It's actually written at the bottom. I know it's a little faded and hard to read, but the translators said this was a description of somebody from Arad that was talking about somebody else who was trying to escape and say he is in the house of the Lord, that temple. And this is the very earliest mention of the temple while the Temple of Solomon, the first temple, actually existed. Okay. Sorry if I get excited about this stuff, but this is really, really fascinating stuff if you're really into studying the background of the Bible. Okay, now we're going to get to something we talked about earlier. No, we didn't talk about this one, the next one. This is the cylinder of King Nabonidus. Who on earth is King Nabonidus? He was the last king of Babylon. He is not mentioned by name in the Bible. But here's why I wanted to show this cylinder. This is again a cylinder that writes the archives of the king. We know from the archives that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon, and he was in exile. And a lot of people say, well, the Bible says Belshazzar was the king. And this is the famous story of the writing on the wall here in Daniel chapter 5. But then as we studied the archaeology of this cylinder of Nabonidus, he mentions, oh, I'm in exile, but I've got a son called Belshazzar who's ruling in Babylon. And this event of the feast and so on was in Babylon where the writing of the wall took place. And so here archaeologists helped us solve a mystery. Why does the Bible mention Belshazzar as king when secular history says Nabonidus was king? Well, they were really co-regents. One was in exile and the other actually ran the country from Babylon, Belshazzar. And now we get to the edict of King Cyrus. I alluded to that earlier in 535 BCE. In Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, it says, now in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom saying, whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. Well, we have now found a cylinder, which is an inscription of Cyrus. We know it's Cyrus, and it's done in the form of a cylinder, and it actually alludes to, it doesn't use exactly the same words, but it alludes to, it says, it describes the deeds of King Cyrus, and it actually says, I gathered all their inhabitants and returned to them their dwellings. So he virtually repeats in the same idea, not the exact same words, but the same idea in this record that's inscribed on this cylinder, that he was letting everybody go back to their countries. The people in exile could go back to their own lands. And this is actually written on the cylinder that was contemporaneous with this toward the end of 2 Chronicles. Okay, now I have to show something that is really, really exciting. Nobody hardly knows about this unless you've been in Israel and looked at the museums. This is not in any textbooks because it's so new that we have now found tablets that are exactly dated from the early 5th century BC, right after the Judean people in exile, because not everybody went back. I think Bible scholars say there were 3 returns from exile, but not everybody went back. And the verse that I really like that connects with this in Psalm 137, it's a psalm that was written in exile while they were in Babylon. It says, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. So this was a psalm written by Jewish exiles in the area of Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon. Well, until very recently, we had almost no archaeological evidence whatsoever of Jews being in Babylon during the time of the exile or right after the exile. But now we have them. They found a cache of these tablets written in cuneiform, but they are written in cuneiform with Jewish names and places. And this is just one example of it. There's a whole exhibit on it you can still go to. This is a mind-blowing discovery of something that we had absolutely no evidence for in archaeology, and now we have it, and these tablets are even dated to the exact year of the king of Persia. And these tablets are from Babylon. They describe Jewish life in exile, and they mention several names that we also find in the Bible, and actually mention what life was like of the Jews in exile. And again, this is a good example of archaeology filling in details that we really would not have get, but yet is connected to specifically what the Bible says. And one of the tablets, just to show you, this was not just a cuneiform. The exiles actually remembered their own language and wrote on the edge of one of the tablets in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, in Paleo Hebrew, Shin, Lamed, Hey. I think that's a Yud and another Hey, but I'm not an expert in paleographic Hebrew. But the point is, they still had a memory 100 years later in exile of their own alphabet, even though they had also adopted the cuneiform Akkadian alphabet here. I think that's Akkadian, I'm not 100% sure. So the last type of inscription we want to look at now are what we call seals from archaeology. Seal inscriptions are eyewitness accounts. They're similar to the other inscriptions, but these are seals where they would make a stamp, just like you have a stamp today, except usually it's ink instead of, but they would make a stamp and then stamp it on a piece of mud or plaster in order to make an imprint of this seal for perhaps official or legal reasons. But what's fascinating is that these seals mention the names of the people, so they're eyewitness accounts of people. Now, we don't know who all the people are because there are lots of people that did their seals, but sometimes the seals mention people in the Bible. Now, before I show you this, there's one famous seal that I'm declining to show, that it was said that there was a seal of Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah, the son of Neri, which I used to show, but there's pretty good evidence that it may have been a forgery. So I'm declining to show that here, but we do have enough fascinating seals of other people that we know were not picked up on the antiquities market, which is where all of these forgeries occur, but were found in situ by professional archaeologists. The first one was found in Megiddo. It's called a Jeroboam seal. It was found actually about 100 years ago, but it was a very clear seal with a lion, and it says Leshama Eved Yeruam in Hebrew, but it's written in Paleo Hebrew. But what's interesting is in 1 Kings, it says it came about when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him and made him the assembly and made him king of Israel. This actually mentions at the bottom Jeroboam the king. It says the seal is for a servant of the king, but the name of the king is actually mentioned here. Now, there is a little bit of a problem because the Bible mentions two Jeroboam. Was this Jeroboam the first or Jeroboam the second? We're not 100% sure. Probably Jeroboam the first, but we really don't know. Yet, we'd have to go back and look at the layers of the excavation and so on. There's a whole story I could tell you behind the seal, but I'm not going to today. Okay, the next one is we have found in situ the impressions of King Hezekiah. And you've already heard me mention him several times. He had his own seal from the late 8th century BCE, and 2 Kings again mentions at 18, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. Here are two examples of the actual stamp of King Hezekiah that we have today. There probably are several more that they found in controlled archaeological digs. These are not fakes. And here is an illustration that I picked up that shows it more clearly. At the top, it says Lechezkiyahu, and then Achaz, the Z is on the next line here. Melech, there's Mem Lamed Chaf. Yehuda, interesting, it says king of Judah, not king of Israel. And it mentions not only Hezekiah, but that he was of Achaz, the king of Judah. And what's really fascinating with Hezekiah, and I'm not going to answer this question right now, is he is showing symbols that we see only in Egypt. There's the Ankh, and there is the wings of the bird, which you can see examples of in Egypt. What's this doing on a seal of Hezekiah? I'll just let you think about that. We got to get through this, and it's a lot of fascinating stuff. And these are authentic seals found in situ by professional archaeologists, not forgeries in the market. And then one that was only found 2 years ago is really fascinating. They believe that they have now actually found a seal of the prophet Isaiah. And we know that Isaiah was a good friend of King Hezekiah, and he probably had the authority of Hezekiah's prophet, which is why we have his seal. Because not some of the prophets, we certainly don't have the seal because they were considered as renegades in the by the king. But Hezekiah and Isaiah were good friends and are even mentioned together in 2 Chronicles 32:20. It says, but when King Hezekiah and Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, prayed about this and cried out to heaven. But you see, they're mentioned together. They were colleagues. And so Hezekiah, or rather Isaiah, who, by the way, was extremely literate in Hebrew. If you read the book of Isaiah, it's written in very high literary Hebrew. But what they have found is a seal, and I have to show you a picture here, both with the seal itself. They found a seal in situ that says belonging to, that's the le, Yeshayah, who, and only the vav is missing. It's Yeshayah, which was another name for Isaiah. And then you see on the left here in blue letters how they restored what they believed the seal would have, because the seal is broken right here. And so they did what they thought was a restoration. But then the fascinating thing, it just wasn't the name Isaiah, but it actually uses the word Navi. Here, Nun, Beit, Yud, but again, the Aleph is missing in Hebrew here, but it actually says Isaiah prophet. You can't get hardly better evidence than that. And this is very reasonable that Isaiah would have had his own seal because he was a colleague and friend of the king and would have had some authority in Jerusalem at that time, and he was definitely a contemporary. This seal was only found a couple of years ago, but it was found by archaeologists, not in some antiquity shop. So we're 99% sure that this is authentic. I know there's some debate. Why wasn't he called the prophet? And this is why I wrote in English, belonging. This is the word lamed. H is missing in Isaiah. The is missing. And I put ET in parentheses because the last letter in Hebrew, Aleph, is missing also for Navi. But this is really, really, really fascinating. And most professional archaeologists believe this does indeed refer to Isaiah the prophet. Okay, now we're finished with Old Testament archaeology. there's a lot there, and believe me, it was tough for me to winnow down stuff. There's a lot more I could show, but those are what I consider the most important discoveries in Old Testament archaeology. Let's talk a little bit about New Testament archaeology, because it's really a different kind of archaeology, a different style, and so on. The New Testament archaeology can fill in details or provide a clearer picture of places and events in the New Testament. So let's look at some examples of New Testament archaeology. First of all, we have what's almost certainly the house of Simon Peter. In Mark 1:29, it says, and immediately after they came out of the synagogue, and we know that the synagogue from the context is in Capernaum, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew in Capernaum. Well, they've now done excavations at Capernaum. Now what you're seeing here is not Peter's house. This was an octagonal church that was built from the memory of Peter's house. In other words, Peter was an extremely important figure among the early Christians, and they had a memory of where his house was, and they've actually excavated, I believe, at least 2 layers down from the octagonal church that you see on the top. Now, if you go to this site, they've now built a modern church over that site. If you go to Capernaum today, but this was a picture before they built the site. And what they had found is at least 2 layers, and at the bottom layer, they found what they believe is to be the actual house of Peter. And this is a reconstruction done by the archaeologists of a typical house in the New Testament, which may well have been Peter's house, because it's right at the site where this church was built. And because the memory of where Peter lived would have lived on quite a long while afterwards. Now we have the famous Jesus boat. In Mark 4:1, it says, he, Jesus, began to teach again by the sea, and he got into a boat in the sea, sat down, and the whole crowd was by the sea on the land. Believe it or not, when the Sea of Galilee got really dry in the 1980s, preserved in mud, they actually found a boat that was dated to the time no later than 50 AD, to the time of the New Testament and possibly the time of the ministry of Jesus Christ. Now, they all call it the Jesus boat. That's the popular name, because Jesus could well have been in this boat. I don't know if Jesus actually rode in this boat or not, but what's fascinating, it tells us a little about what boats were like in the time of the New Testament. It's archaeological evidence of a boat from the time of the New Testament in the Sea of Galilee. And this tells us a little bit about the structure and the size of these boats. These were not huge boats. You can see why the disciples got afraid when there was a storm on the sea. This was not a big boat. And it also tells us a little bit of construction methods. Okay, another very recent discovery many of you may not have heard of is the synagogue at Magdala. It's interesting, the King James Bible actually mentions the name Magdala, but most modern Bibles don't because of textual issues, which I don't want to get into now. But in Matthew 15:39 in the King James Bible, it says, he sent away the multitude, took ship, and came to the coast of Magdala. Well, Magdala was a city along the coast of the Sea of Galilee, but the problem is the textual evidence seemed to point to a slightly different name, but I just wanted to point out that the King James Bible does mention Magdala, but more famous mention of Magdala is in Luke 8:2, which also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses, Mary called the Magdalene. Well, everybody's heard of Mary Magdalene, but their name Magdalene says she came from Magdala. And they've done research and archaeology excavations at Magdala only in the last 5 to 10 years. And lo and behold, they found a synagogue that's clearly dated from the first temple. This is extremely rare. Most synagogues are later than the first century. There's a handful of late first century synagogues, but this may be the very earliest synagogue ever discovered in archaeology. And there are many people that say Jesus Christ himself may have been in this synagogue because the date goes back to the time of the synagogue. He knew Mary Magdalene, and some would say Jesus himself may have walked in this synagogue. But wait, there's more, because this is the 1st century synagogue, you see that little white stand in the center of the synagogue? This was probably the most fascinating discovery besides the synagogue. Here's a close-up view. This is considered a contemporary carving of how the Second Temple may have looked. Now, it's still stylized, but what you have is another rare example of a menorah here, and then you have 2 columns of the temple on left and right, and then also pitchers of oil, which might have been offering, but this might have been an eyewitness picture drawn based on the temple that was still standing at the time that this synagogue was made. So here we have a synagogue, because it's mentioned many times in the gospel. Jesus went into synagogues. It doesn't say he went to the synagogue in Magdala, but he well could have gone, because he went into lots of other synagogues and taught there. And here we have a 1st century synagogue that well could have been a place that Jesus walked. Okay, then we have another thing that's mentioned in the New Testament. In John 9:7, it says, and Jesus said to him, this was the man who was born blind, go wash in the pool of Siloam. We know that the pool of Siloam was where the water came out from the tunnel of Hezekiah that we saw in earlier pictures, and many people thought the pool was right at the exit of Siloam. But we now know that that pool there was just simply a later Byzantine church built to commemorate that event. But more recently, they have found a much, much more grander pool that is built in a Greco-Roman style. And here's the excavations of it, where the water would have come in and accumulated, and it would have been a well-known pool that Jesus would have sent this man to go and wash his eyes out in this pool. And we have found, which everybody agrees now, is the New Testament pool of Siloam, and we can actually see how it was today. Now, we now go to burial, what's called a bone box, or an ossuary is what the archaeologists call it. Now, ossuary is not directly mentioned in the New Testament, but it is alluded to in the New Testament, and we'll see why. Because in John 11:38, this is the picture of the story of the raising of Lazarus. So Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb of Lazarus. And what is this tomb? It's not like a tomb today. It wasn't some sort of a, what do they call it today? A fancy mausoleum. That's the word I'm looking for. It was not a mausoleum. It was a cave. And it says there was a stone laying against the cave, just like the cave of the resurrection of Jesus. It says he was put in a cave, and there was a stone rolled in front of the cave too. But this is Lazarus. It was a cave. Well, think about it. Not everybody could have been in a cave, because there weren't that many caves. There was way more people than there were caves. So we know now from archaeology that the cave was more temporary, that they would put the dead person in a cave, and this was a practice during the time of the New Testament. And then after a year or so, when the flesh had decayed in the cave, they would then put it in what's called an ossuary. And here's an example of pictures of ossuaries in a cave, that they would take the deceased and put him in a box for more permanent storage, and which is called an ossuary. And now we have many examples of ossuaries, because many times they would write the name of the deceased on the ossuary here. And now that I've explained what an ossuary is, and it's even alluded to here about Lazarus, they didn't bury him in a cave, they put him in a cave. And later they would have put him, where he's still dead, into an ossuary. Okay, now here's the most famous ossuary. There's some controversy. Some people think it's a forgery. I think the weight of evidence, and I have other professionals that agree, still points that it may be genuine. But in Galatians 1:9, it says, I, Paul, did not see any other of the apostles except James, the Lord's brother. Well, we have actually found, and maybe some of you have heard about it in the news, an ossuary, a pretty plain looking ossuary, but there's some writing on it. And if you look closely, it's writing in Aramaic that says, James, Yaakov, you can even see the name Yaakov, son of Joseph, Yosef, but then the most important one is brother of Jesus, and you see Yeshua inscribed on the far left. Is this fake? Is it authentic? I don't know 100%, but all the researchers that have looked at it say they have not found any clear evidence that it is fake. If it's a fake, it is an extremely well done fake. But this is probably the most famous ossuary of all, because we know that James died, according to church tradition. I believe he was thrown off the temple or something like that, or put to death. We know James, the brother of Jesus, was put to death. He became a martyr before the destruction of Jerusalem. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, we don't see any more of these ossuaries. It was only during the period of the Gospels in the New Testament. Then we have another very famous one, Matthew 26:3. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas. So we know the name Caiaphas. He's mentioned in other places. Well, believe it or not, they found a very fancy ossuary. You see, they sometimes had fancy carvings on the side. And then they actually found inscribed on the ossuary, Joseph, the son of Caiaphas. Now, maybe this is Joseph's ossuary, but the point I'm trying to make is he actually names a person named Caiaphas from the same period as Caiaphas is mentioned in the time of the New Testament. And Caiaphas wasn't a very common name. Joseph was, but Caiaphas wasn't. So this is likely the ossuary of either Caiaphas or the son of Caiaphas. And then we have an inscription. I'm trying to go in chronological order. This is not an ossuary, but it's an inscription. This is about Pontius Pilate. In Matthew 27:2, it says, they bound him, Jesus, led him away, delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Well, they actually found, this is the only external archaeological evidence, they found an inscription that mentions Pilate, Pontius Pilate. It's the only archaeological evidence. And here I've zoomed into it. If you translate, it's written in Latin, to Tiberius. And by the way, here's another witness of Tiberius, the emperor. Pontius Pilate. And I think even now you can see Pilatus here written in Latin letters. And then at the bottom, it's a little harder to read, but they've decided it means prefect of Judea. And by the way, it also uses the correct official title of Pontius Pilate. He was the prefect. He wasn't the king of Judea. But the bottom line is a little harder to read. But you can clearly see Pilatus here in Latin on this inscription. And so here is our only archaeological mention of Pontius Pilate. And then we have the only archaeological evidence of crucifixion. And this is a ossuary of John of Hagkol. We don't know what Hagkol means, but we do see his name on a box. He was crucified in the 1st century CE, which is exactly the same period of the crucifixion. In John 19:18, it says they crucified him, Jesus, and 2 others with him. The crucifixion was a very common punishment. It wasn't just those 3 people, one on either side with Jesus in the middle. We found this box where they actually preserved, he must have been a more well-known person because probably most of the crucified people were probably thrown in a common grave. If you look carefully, you see some writing here on the side, which is Yochanan in Hebrew, and then Hagdol, or Hagkol. It's a little hard to pronounce, but the most interesting thing was inside the box. Inside the box, they actually found a bone, a human bone with a nail in it. And why is that nailed to that bone? It's because he was crucified. Why do we not find more examples of crucifixion? Because either they didn't keep it in a bone box, or more importantly, you see a bend in the nail in the left end. It's almost like they hit a knot of wood and couldn't reuse the nail. And a lot of times they either reuse the nail, or some people have even speculated that later on pilgrims grabbed the nails as relics from that time. I don't know what's true, but in any case, they couldn't remove the nail, so the nails stayed there, and it's clearly driven through the bone, and then they hit a knot of wood, and it was curved at the left end here. But this is the only archaeological evidence we've known, although I have heard that they found possibly one more case in Italy of a guy with a hole in his foot bone. That might be in the second case, but for many years, this was the only archaeological evidence of crucifixion, despite it being a common practice. Okay, we're just about finished. We're done with the Gospels. We'll just look at a few more examples here that are mentioned in the later part of the New Testament. First, we have the theater of Ephesus. In Acts 19:29, it says, the city Ephesus was filled with the confusion. They rushed to one accord into the theater. Well, the theater is a huge item. It has survived, and here is the theater of Ephesus, and it's quite close to the harbor, would have been here beyond where these row of trees are, but over the centuries, the harbor silted up and it's now full of soil and mud, but the theater still stands, and this road in front of the theater would have been the road to the harbor here. And so my point is, we can see the actual theater today that is mentioned here in Acts 12:29. Acts also mentions the imprisonment of Paul at Caesarea. It says in Acts 23:35, and he ordered that he, Paul, be kept under guard, where? In Herod's palace, and they were at Caesarea. We already know that from the context. Well, they have now found Herod's palace in Caesarea. It is quite a grand structure. Here are all the buildings. Here, there are some columns out toward the sea, and they've even found a swimming pool that sticks out into the sea here. And here's a closer view, a different perspective where the sea is in the background. But they've actually found some underground chambers, which are very, very likely the place where Paul would have actually been kept in this palace. And his palace is also the site of where he made an appeal to Felix and Festus in the same palace as he was imprisoned there. And the archaeologists have pointed out a room which is very likely the reception room of where Paul, the apostle, would have stood at this palace. Okay, now we're going to go to the temple inscription, late 1st century. This relates to the destruction of Jerusalem. In Mark 13:1, it says, as he, Jesus, was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Jesus, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. Well, we've actually found a part of that wonderful building. It is a part that has an inscription. Now, we still have the Temple Mount itself, but this is a piece of stone from the top that fell down. And what's fascinating is it says, to the place of trumpeting. We actually can read the inscription. You can even see the word lebet hatkiyah. The last part's a little more, we're not sure what the last part means, but here's a little drawing to show you how that part fell down near the corner of the temple, and there's the priest blowing the trumpet, possibly to announce the beginning and end of Sabbath. But that inscription would have been right on the edge of this wall. It fell down, and we can see it today. So this illustrates the grandeur of the temple. But if we continue in that same passage, in Mark 13:2, says, Jesus said to him, to the disciple that said how great the buildings are, he says, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will be torn down. Well, today we can see the stones that were tumbled down. But instead of showing you the stones, I want to show you what happened after the stones were torn down. The Roman general Titus took the implements of the temple, and we can actually see a picture under his arch, in the Arch of Titus in Rome. Here we see the menorah, which was a solid gold object. Here we see other implements of the temple. Here and see some trumpets and other implements, and they're carrying them in the victory march in Rome. And I don't want to get into questions about, is the menorah still hidden in Rome? I doubt it, but there's still sort of a story that it's still there and it ought to be returned to Israel, but I doubt if it's there. It was probably melted down for the gold. But anyway, my point is, here is an actual physical record of the destruction of the temple and of the Roman slaves taking the implements of the temple back to Rome, or in the victory march to Rome. Okay, that was a lot. I'm not going to give you a test. I know I covered a lot of material, but I just wanted to show you the humongous, the huge contribution that archaeology contributes to biblical studies, just so that it'll have some, maybe some things to grab onto as you talk about the relationship of archaeology and biblical study. But I would conclude here that there's reasonably good agreement between many of the items shown here in portions of the Bible, text of the Bible. Now, I don't deny there are problems. The archaeology in a few places doesn't seem to always exactly agree. There are problems. I'm not going to say there aren't any problems, but I would say there's lots of good agreement. Okay, and I think my answer to the problems is let's keep digging. Okay, many of the items shown here do indeed illustrate and fill in details, and I hope you've seen from all the myriad items how this does this. And the relationship of archaeology and the Bible, I think, really enhances the reality of the Bible. We're talking about something that has a lot of archaeological evidence, and that this will enhance the reality of the Bible, especially in modern times. I say even, but especially in modern times. Okay, well, this finishes this. We're gonna take questions. I think I'm still have a half hour, and I appreciate your patience in listening this long, but we're gonna go ahead and close this. And then I just want to take 5 minutes to show you a little bit about accordance here. Let's see here. I want to show you a little bit of accordance. Let me just move this. I have this webinar control panel. Let's go now, bring accordance to the front, and I want to just show you a little bit of what's in accordance. Okay. Accordance, I'm going to show you first 3 products. Now I believe they're all on sale, and I hope this one is. The first product I want to show you we have myriads, I would estimate around 40,000 graphic resources on accordance from different sources. And I would say graphic resources are one of the really strong points of accordance that you won't see anywhere else in either software or a book. Here I'm showing you our first product, which we only recently introduced. This is called Picture the New Testament. And what Picture the New Testament is a pictorial commentary on the New Testament. Anything that can be illustrated with a picture, we put in here. This is a commentary of the entire New Testament loaded with pictures, but the thing is we put it in verse order so that as you scroll verse by verse, the commentary scrolls with you and shows you the pictures related to that verse. So let's go back up to the top now to Matthew 2:1. It says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Well, this particular verse has lots of illustrations. First, we're going to talk about Bethlehem. So we put subtitles. Here's a map of Bethlehem. You could click on it and see where Bethlehem is. Okay, then you see pictures of the town of Bethlehem. Here's the overview of the town. Here's a picture from a top overlay showing Bethlehem today. And here's a picture of the Church of the Nativity where Bethlehem is today. So you see, and not only do we show you pictures, but we show you a detailed description of the picture along with hyperlinks. You could see hyperlink to Herodium and so on. And not only that, we go inside the basilica, and here is the silver star. This is the traditional site where Jesus was born. And then this is only a brief overview of things related to Bethlehem. If you want to see more, you just click on Bethlehem, and now we go to the photo guide, and now you can see even more pictures of Bethlehem along with detailed descriptions. So anyway, let's go back now. This is on a separate tab. Now that's just Bethlehem. Now let's go to Judea. So now we go to Judea. Here is a map of Judea so that you see where it's located. And then here's sort of an overview of the hill country of Judea. And then here is a really interesting coins showing the defeat. And you could see the word Judea here. Here is the Roman defeat. This is the woman in sorrow with the Roman overlord standing. I think we have another picture. There's another picture of the Roman soldier with the palm tree and Judea. And it actually mentions Judea in Latin letters. So here is the coins commemorating the defeat of Judea, but with the actual words Judea. And again, likewise, you can go and see even more on Judea. Now we go to Herod. This is Herod the Great, who ruled in Jerusalem. We give a little introduction to him, and then we go to a reconstruction of Herod's tomb in Herodium, the actual one, but this is a reconstruction of his tomb done in recent excavations at the Herodium, where even Josephus says he was buried. And then we can go here, and this is likely Herod's sarcophagus where he was buried. Now you could see it was really broken up, and they had to do a lot of restoration. But here is Herod's sarcophagus, describing the same Herod. Okay, and again, I don't know that we have an article on Herod. I think we do in the photo museum, but anyway, there's some pictures along with a detailed description. You can even go to Josephus' Antiquities and see where Herod is mentioned. There's the Herodian mentioned in Josephus. So this really is a springboard where you can go to more detail. And then finally, wise men from the east. These were probably from Mesopotamia. And so here's some tablets in the British Museum that talk about astrology. And they actually mention Halley's Comet, which wasn't too much earlier, 164 BC, than the wise men. And then here is a mosaic from an early 5th century church showing the wise men coming to Jesus from a portrayal, how they understood it in the 5th century. And then we go to Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem, we've got tons of photos. We only show 2. Here's an air shot of Jerusalem today with mainly the old city, showing there's the Temple Mount. And then we have the model of Jerusalem, this is how Jerusalem may have looked in the 1st century AD or CE. Okay, and of course we say for more pictures of Jerusalem, you can go to Jerusalem, and we've got hundreds of pictures of Jerusalem. I'll just show you here. Let me just open it this way. Whoops, let's try again. There we go. You can see we have hundreds of pictures of different articles of Jerusalem, all with detailed annotation. These are not just simply somebody's archive, but these are detailed pictures of Jerusalem along with explanation and Bible references and so on. Now, all of this was just a commentary on verse 1 of Matthew. We could now go to verse 2, and now we see King of the Jews. And then there we're showing these stones that I showed you earlier of Jewish exiles, and maybe they had a memory. They had interaction with Jewish community, the King of the Jews. And then we have something of Jews. What do we mean by Jews? Well, here's a funerary inscription that's written in Greek from Rome, but it has in Hebrew shalom, and it even shows the menorah and the shofar and the lulav, the palm branch. And this is from Rome. So there's an example of Jews. And here's another Jewish inscription with a menorah. These are the Jews in Rome, but there it mentions the King of the Jews. And then here's again the same things about the star, along with, if you go to Bethlehem today, they call this Star Street, which is traditionally, I don't think it's very authentic, the street where the Magi or the wise men would have walked on to Bethlehem. It's called Star Street. I think it's very traditional. All of that is just a comment on now verse 2, and we can keep going. There's verse 3, there's verse 4, assembled all the chief priests and scribes. Where did the Sanhedrin meet? They probably met here in these columns in the model of the temple. And here's a Jewish coin that actually mentions the Council of the Jews. And here's a reconstruction of the high priest in his garb. And there's a picture of scribes. Here's a modern day scribe. Don't worry about his watch. But here is a guy, actually an Orthodox Jewish man, actually writing a Torah scroll, which is what a scribe would have done. And then here is the Samaritan Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Bible from the Samaritans, which were also written in Samaritan language on the outside. Anyway, I could keep going on this forever, but I don't want to use, I'm already an hour and a half here, but let me just show you now. This is the picture of the New Testament commentary. It is the entire New Testament has a photo commentary. This is a unique product you'll not find in any other software or book. And it's a very quick way of scrolling. So you could say, I'm preparing this text. What are some pictures that illustrate this text? Okay, let's go to a couple of other things. Here's the photo guide, Israel. And here is, well, no, not that one. I want to show this one. Here's an article on Megiddo. Again, this is a unique product. It does not exist in any other software or printed book. Here's an article on Megiddo with a detailed introduction with lots of Bible references. If I open up the instant details, and as accordance users, you should know what that is. Shift Option Command 2. You see, you could get all the verses here. And then now we have this whole series of a detailed description of Megiddo. Here's the gates of Megiddo that I talked about earlier. Here's the Canaanite altar. And again, all of them you can zoom in and get a big picture of. And then here is the granary, and here is even the water tunnel. You can go down inside the water tunnel, and there's the length of the tunnel. And then at the end, here is the spring where the water came out of the tunnel before you go up. And all of this is just the article on Megiddo. And we tried to cover almost every Bible site that you can illustrate, especially in Israel and Jordan and Egypt. Syria and Iraq are a little bit harder. We have a few pictures of Syria and Iraq, but especially in Israel, this is all. And notice this is Photo Guide Israel. The photo guide we originally had got so big that we actually split it into regions so that you could just get the one for Israel. Or here's an example of the one in Egypt. Here's an example of one of the Egyptian tombs at Saqqara. And again, there's really nothing like that. This is almost a summary of sites in Egypt. Here we go into the tomb. There's an overview of the tomb. And there's the people, the servants working or fishing. You see the fish at the bottom. And here's another similar picture here. And there is the owner of the tomb along with his wheat. Now, I don't know hieroglyphics. I don't know the interpretation of all of this. And there's another, but this is again in the chapel, I believe, the tomb. And there's another picture. I think that's his wife and so on. But my point is, this is a detailed description of pictures in Egypt, many of which relate to the Bible. And so Egypt has its own. Here's a very fascinating picture of an Egyptian ship inside the tomb. And I think this is another one. There's the Egyptians bringing honey, beehives, and farm implements to show you life in Egypt at the time of the Bible. So there's a lot of very, very interesting pictures here. And then one more tool I want to point out is the photo museum. The photo museum, again, is a very unique tool. The photo guide sort of focuses on the places in the Bible. The photo museum focuses on objects in the Bible. And again, like the others, this is a unique tool. There's nothing like it in written or in software. Here's an article on chariots in which we give a detailed description of the chariots. Here's a Mesopotamian chariot that's a little bit hard to see. I guess I have to trust him. That says that's the chariot driver, but I don't see much. I think the next one is a lot more clear. There's the chariot of Egypt, of Pharaoh in a battle. And this is the battle chariot. And here's a array of chariots from the Assyrians, and you can see several chariots in this picture. And then here's the king on his chariots with his soldiers, he's fighting the army there and so on. And this is just a tiny fraction of it. And again, there's a very detailed description. And here's another interesting one on a coin. There's chariots on a coin from Greece, a picture. So anyway, and then you see naval warfare. We can talk about, here's a Phoenician warship. Anyway, this is a detailed description of objects and people groups. Like we talk about who are the Phoenicians, who are the Philistines, who are the Egyptians, who are the Canaanites, who are the Moabites, and so on. I think we can even find it on, here's our table of contents. Let's see if I can find it. Moabites, yeah, there's the Moabites. We have a whole article just on the Moabites and all the archaeology related to the Moabites here in detail. Anyway, this is a unique tool you can't find anywhere else, with very lavishly illustrated with pictures. Well, I think I've done enough selling of the graphics resources to you, and I think want to take time. I've already taken over an hour and a half. I want to take time for questions. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the here and open up my video, and I think I'll let the moderator my video, there we go. So I'll look a little more personal. I guess my question to Richard, who's moderating this, does anyone have any questions, or did I overwhelm everybody?
No, well, first, Roy, thank you so much. That was really good and interesting. I know we went over it a little bit before, but I never get tired of hearing your teaching.
Well, I had a little more detail than what we did
Yeah, you
before.
did. It was great. Hey, I want to let all those that are here before we get into questions know that this week we do have the photo guides, the photo museum on sale at 50% off our regular price, and the picture of the New Testament we have it on at about a 66% discount. So that's really good. And then also when Linda sends out an email to everyone from this session, we have a coupon code in it. It is eAcademy 25, and that will give you a 25% discount, a one-time use. You can use it towards a custom upgrade. You can put together several books into that, and you get a 25% off on your purchase. Now, it's a one-time use, and it will not be good on anything that is currently on sale. So just to let you know on that, but you will be getting that code in an email follow-up from Linda. So I guess I'm going to go to questions, if that's okay.
Richard, before you get into the questions, I want to just reinforce what you're saying, that almost every picture I showed in the keynote presentation, you can get on Accordance. Those are not I took a lot of the pictures, but they are distributed on Accordance, and if you want those pictures, almost every one of them will be on a product of Accordance.
Great. Roy, I got a couple questions, and then Mark, if you see anything that I miss, feel free to chime in. The first question I have for you is, these inscriptions that you're talking about, are they eyewitness accounts? Could they just be second or third? Who knows how removed accounts they are, recorded by a scribe or some other official who wasn't actually there? Am I misunderstanding the meaning of eyewitness, or does he mean?
I'm not a. Oh, go ahead, finish, Richard. I thought.
Yeah. So basically, are they 2 or 3 eyewitnesses removed? Or are they? What do you know about that?
In my opinion, most of what I showed was probably eyewitness, especially these seals. Those are definitely eyewitness, because nobody, anything can happen. There's, one of the big controversies in archaeology is how much do we have now as fake? And the temptation to make fakes is just almost irresistible, because if you make an archaeological artifact that connects the Bible, you'll almost certainly get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for it. So it's really worth it to make a very, very good fake. And there's a lot of debate on what's fake and what's not fake. But I would say if it was found professionally in situ and the professional archaeologists have dated it, I would say it would be an eyewitness. I'd have to go through the inscriptions one by one to see what would be considered a second or third generation. But I would say most of what I showed you was probably first generation witness, but I don't want to say all of them were. I'd have to go through them. Like, for example, the inscription of the House of David was 100 years later than the King David, but it shows how early David was. Okay, Helen is correcting me here that I should use the word contemporary, not eyewitness accounts. Yeah, contemporary accounts. That's the, okay. All right, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I would say most of what I showed was contemporary.
Okay, then we have, does Accordance have the transcripts of archaeological finds in a database?
Absolutely, they do. If you buy context of scripture, that will have almost every, or an English translation of almost every transcription, and we probably in some of our other books also have other, like a very good one, for example, is Echoes of the Past by Carta. It not only gives a complete transcript of all Hebrew inscriptions, but even gives a commentary on them. And so I would say Echoes of the Past focuses mainly on Hebrew inscriptions, but also the context of scripture gives a translation of almost every, even the Egyptian and the Akkadian and Assyrian inscriptions are translated there.
Yeah, and just so that people know, if you already own the 3 volumes of Context of Scripture by Brill, we are going to be doing the 4th volume that is an index, and that should be out later this summer, just to let people know.
And to further, oh, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, to further pump up Richard here, the Context of Scripture on Accordance was cleaned up, hyperlinked, and it's much more useful than just reading the book. Like, for example, it cites in their footnotes Bible references that connect to that site, that inscription, and you can, in accordance, hyperlink to that Bible reference to say, here's a verse, is there some inscription that connects with this verse? And that's something you really can't do easily on the printed version.
That's true. And I also have to say that later this summer, the price we have, our regular price on the 3 volume set is $199, and through the publisher, they've requested that we raise it to $299. So the price is going to be going up on that 3 volume set. And if you get the 25% off of $199, that's a really pretty decent deal. If you're into, it's sort of a difficult work to get through, but it's very helpful. But yeah, that price on that Context of Scripture is going up, just to let everyone know. What do you think, Roy, about the BAR, the Biblical Archaeological Review? What do you think about that work?
It is controversial because Herschel Shank, who is the founder, and I think he's now retired, he liked to stoke controversy a little bit. But I think it's an outstanding resource for connection of the Bible and archaeology. Doesn't mean you agree with everything. Some of his authors do not have very high views of the Bible, but I think it is probably the best resource to connect laymen. And if you don't agree with it, just ignore it. But it's lavishly illustrated, and Herschel Shanks is a lawyer who really tries to be fair with the evidence. I can't say that always with some of his authors, but he himself really tried to be fair and to give credence, and he's very balanced, even though he is of a Jewish background. He gives lots of archaeology of the New Testament and scholarship of the New Testament. I've taken it personally since the volume 1, number 1. I have every issue of it. It is an outstanding journal, and yes, you don't agree with everything on it, but I think it's a very, very good resource. And of course, I need to mention that you can get the complete issues of BAR up to 2016 on Accordance.
Does it have indexed? Is it indexed?
I think it did some indexing on the early issues, but I'm not aware of any comprehensive index. But again, on Accordance, we've added the fields so that you can search it, search for the titles, search for the articles, even search Hebrew. Where are the Hebrew mentioned in it? Where are the captions in BAR? On Accordance, it's extremely useful if you want to find almost anything. And we're talking now about what? 45 years of journals, almost, or maybe 40 years of journals of BAR. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, BAR, by the way, is on sale too. So it's at 50% off. So if you go to our website, you'll see we are running the sale on the BAR, just like Roy said, the issues that we have.
And I really, sorry, go ahead, finish.
No, go ahead, Roy.
I was going to say, I admire Herschel Shanks for using the term biblical archaeology, because that's gotten in disfavor among many secular archaeologists. But he stuck to it, and he said that is the correct term because we're showing the connection of archaeology to the Bible. Sorry, go ahead.
And also, we've been in contact with BAR the past couple of years about updating not only the BAR journals, but also the Galaxy journals. So that's on our plate to do. Hopefully we will get to that within, I'm hoping sometime this year to get those things updated, but just pray that we can. But we have the ability in the relationship to do it. We just need to find a way to get it done. Okay, question for you, Roy. By the way, everyone's saying fantastic, fascinating, tons of great stuff. Thanks. Awesome. Loved it. One person says, what is the significance and date of the Rosetta Stone?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I didn't even show that because I can't show everything. And the reason I didn't show the Rosetta Stone is it doesn't directly connect to the Bible. But the Rosetta Stone is extremely important because it enabled us to read Egyptian hieroglyphics. That's its significance. It was found in the late 18th century by, I think, Napoleon's scientist in Egypt. And it enabled us because they had it parallel. It's 3 transcriptions parallel in Greek, which everybody could read, in Demotic, that's sort of a cursive hieroglyphics, and in hieroglyphics, and it enabled us to understand the hieroglyphic language, which was really untranslatable. And today there are specialists that know the hieroglyphic language of Egypt, but that Rosetta Stone is what enabled us. It was the breakthrough that enabled us to understand hieroglyphics. And because of that, I was able to show you the few hieroglyphic inscriptions, for example, the one that mentions Egypt. We would not have been able to read that without the Rosetta Stone.
Great. And then kind of along the same line, more about where it's located, but where is the location of the Mesha Stone?
Mesha Stone is in the Louvre in Paris.
The Louvre in Paris.
Rosetta Stone is at the British Museum.
Okay, great. Just a couple more questions.
I highly recommend you visit both museums because they have lots of stuff that can connect with the Bible background.
Okay. What is the best way, because you do a lot of teaching, Roy, what is the best ways to incorporate archaeology in preaching and teaching?
Well, I would, in the New Testament, it's obvious. Use the picture of the New Testament. There, it already tells you which pictures connect with which passage you're teaching and preaching. The other way is to go to the photo guide and photo museum if a place is mentioned and see, can I get more background on that? And use it in my teaching or preaching or in whatever context it might be. I don't know if that really answers the question or not. I mean, you can even, I even use the search all feature, or sorry, that's the old name, the research feature in accordance. I use that and use it to search citations or visual. And that way I can search all of my visual resources and put a word and say, do any of my visual resources show a picture of this particular thing that's mentioned in this verse?
Okay, great. And Mark, why don't you look to see if there's any other question? I do have a comment here from someone that said that they tried the eAcademy 25 code, and for them it.
I've emailed about that, and I've got a couple people that have said that. So
okay,
I've
now
emailed.
You can't use it if you're trying to use it on a sell item. If an item is already currently on sale, like the photo museum or the photo guides or the picture of the New Testament or the Oxford materials or the CBL, the code only works on things that are not on sale. In other words, you can put on sale whatever you want and get 25% off, except for the things that are currently on sale. Mark, do you see any other questions I'm missing?
Yes, there is one other question. How is Picture the New Testament different from the Bible Lands Photo Guide 3?
Okay, that's an excellent question. The Bible Lands Photo Guide 3, first of all, we're updated. We no longer sell the 3. That's an earlier version. We had to expand it, and as I mentioned, split it up into regions of the Middle East or of the Bible lands, such as Europe, Egypt, Turkey, Middle East, and Israel, or Far Near East and Israel. Anyway, the big difference is it is organized by verse reference. The photo guide is organized alphabetically like a Bible, like a profusely illustrated Bible dictionary. And yes, there is some overlap. You'll find some of the pictures on both resources, but I will say because the picture of the New Testament was developed much more recently, there are several pictures there that don't appear in any of our other resources that are more recent photographs that we incorporated in Picture of the New Testament. But there is some overlap. But I can assure you that the upgrade to Bible Photo Lens, Bible Photo Guide, I hope I said it right, 3, we've added many, many more pictures even since that edition of it.
Okay. As soon as we're through here too, I will check at the office to see what's going on with the code. So please be patient and try again in a bit, and we'll see what we can do. Then, okay, another question. Who is the author and or publisher of Echoes of the Past? You know that one, Roy.
Echoes of the Past was done by Carta. I don't remember the name. He was an Israeli scholar that wrote the book, but I don't remember his name, and I don't have the book right in front of me here.
Yeah, it is distributed by Hendrickson in print form, and CBD should have it. But again, when you have it under an electronic format like Accordance, it really does perform a lot better.
And it also is very difficult to do accurately on Accordance because of the Hebrew inscriptions of trying to keep the line up and everything done. That was not an easy book to e-text.
Yes. Well, are there any last questions? Does anybody have anything final to ask?
And I might add, I'll add one more comment. I'm not a professional archaeologist. I enjoy reading and looking at archaeology, but I'm not a professional archaeologist. So if you find an error or something like that, I'd be very happy to hear about it. But I tried to just cover just the generic stuff that's fairly well known and fairly well agreed upon.
Okay.